Picture a lake sitting near the summit of a mountain. Not a puddle, not some seasonal pool left behind by melting snow. A real lake stretching several kilometers wide, resting inside a basin carved out by ancient glaciers. The air up here is so thin that just climbing a gentle slope leaves you gasping. For much of the year, temperatures stay well below freezing. Bare rock surrounds the water, with only scattered patches of alpine plants clinging to life. The closest river system lies hundreds of meters straight down. And the only thing linking that river to this lake is a steep, violent waterfall no living creature could swim up. And yet, there are fish living in this lake. Not one confused straggler you could dismiss as a fluke. An entire population breeding, surviving, thriving in an isolated pocket of freezing water with no visible way in. So how did they get there? It sounds like a simple riddle, almost too simple to deserve a full explanation. But the real answer stretches across deep geological time, evolutionary biology, the strange physics of moving ice, the eating habits of specific birds, and the deliberate choices of ancient humans hauling supplies up mountainsides for reasons that made total sense to them at the time. There's even one mechanism so bizarre that most people's first instinct is to argue against it before hearing the evidence. One thing is certain from the start: these fish did not swim up that waterfall, and the lake certainly didn't relocate itself down to where the fish were swimming. Something else entirely happened here, and it turns out there isn't just one explanation. There are several, and together they make for a far stranger story than the question first suggests. Let's start with the oldest and most literal explanation, because some mountain fish got there simply because the mountain wasn't always a mountain, or because the lake wasn't always cut off from lower water systems the way it is now. On geological timescales, mountains are not permanent fixtures of the landscape. They rise slowly over millions of years, pushed upward by shifting tectonic plates. And the lakes that form on them, whether gouged out by glaciers, split open by tectonic fractures, or dammed by ancient lava flows, often began their existence at far lower elevations. Sometimes those basins were once directly connected to rivers and lakes down in the valleys. Take Lake Titicaca, sitting roughly 800 meters up on the Andean Plateau. It's home to the giant Titicaca water frog, a creature so odd-looking it seems assembled from spare parts. But it also holds several fish species closely related to fish swimming in the Amazon River basin far below. These species aren't there by coincidence. Lake Titicaca once sat at a much lower elevation, linked by ancient rivers to the lowland waters of the Amazon. As the Andes kept rising, those connections were slowly severed. The fish were already there long before the mountains reached their current height. The mountains simply grew up around them. Scientists call this process vivariance, when a once-connected population becomes isolated by geological or geographical change. The fish never traveled to the mountain lake. The mountain lake, in a sense, traveled up to them. Given enough time and enough uplift, this single mechanism can strand fish populations in places that look utterly impossible to reach today. And these isolated populations often become something remarkable, entirely unique species found nowhere else on the planet. Lake Titicaca alone contains several fish species and subspecies that exist absolutely nowhere else, shaped by millions of years spent in total isolation. Ancient communities living beside these high mountain lakes were fishing populations that were, in evolutionary terms, some of the rarest and most distinct on Earth, without having the faintest idea that the ground beneath their feet had been slowly rising for millions of years. Before we go further, if you're enjoying digging into mysteries like this one, take a second to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the strange hidden corners of our ancient past. All right, let's move on to something even stranger. Now let's talk about ice, because this next mechanism is both the most physically bizarre and honestly the most fun to explain. Throughout the Pleistocene, the geological epoch spanning nearly all of early human history, the planet cycled through repeated ice ages. During these glacial periods, massive sheets of ice blanketed huge stretches of mountain terrain. These glaciers weren't frozen in place. They moved, slowly grinding downhill over centuries and millennia, dragging enormous quantities of rock, soil, and anything trapped in the water they absorbed along the way. When a glacier creeps across a lake or river, it can pull in water and, crucially, whatever living things happen to be floating in it, fish included. Fish eggs are especially vulnerable to this kind of accidental hitchhiking. They're small, tough enough to survive freezing under the right conditions, and they exist in massive numbers along the shallow edges of lakes, exactly where glaciers make contact with water. Once frozen inside the ice, those eggs go along for the ride. Over years, sometimes decades, the glacier hauls its frozen cargo across the shifting landscape. Eventually, when the ice melts, whether seasonally at the glacier's edges or completely as the climate warms, everything it carried gets deposited wherever that melting happens to occur. If the glacier had been grinding uphill, or if its terminal edge sat higher than where it originally formed, material from a low-elevation lake could end up dumped at a much higher elevation entirely. Fish eggs released into meltwater pools can, over time, hatch into a permanent population, especially if that pool eventually becomes a stable lake fed by rainfall and ongoing glacial runoff. Of course, surviving glacial transport isn't easy. Temperature swings, oxygen levels, and the sheer physical grinding force of moving ice all threaten an egg's viability. Most attempts at this kind of transport fail completely. But across the sheer scale of glacial activity throughout the Pleistocene, the number of these accidental transport events was staggering, and even a tiny success rate, multiplied across thousands of years and countless glaciers, is more than enough to explain fish showing up in lakes where no other explanation seems to apply. Ancient humans living in these mountain regions during or right after an ice age were walking through landscapes freshly rearranged by exactly this kind of process. Bodies of water, and the fish inside them, were often brand new arrivals, recent enough that the ecosystem itself still bore the marks of that upheaval. Now here's a mechanism that sounds almost too strange to be real, but it's extremely well documented. Birds are responsible for far more mountain lake fish populations than seems physically reasonable. Herons, ospreys, eagles, kingfishers, ducks, grebes, all of them regularly transport fish and fish eggs between separate bodies of water entirely without meaning to. The most studied version of this involves fish eggs sticking directly to a bird's feathers and feet. Eggs laid in the shallow edges of lakes are often coated in a sticky adhesive meant to help them cling to rocks and plants. That same stickiness works just as well on the legs and feathers of a wading bird. A bird wades through a lake full of fish, then flies off and wades into a completely different lake, and just like that, it's carried viable eggs between the two. How many eggs actually survive the trip depends on flight time, temperature, and how well the eggs resist drying out. But experiments have shown that eggs from multiple species can survive being transported for several hours. Easily enough time for a bird to fly from a lowland lake straight up to a mountain basin. Ducks turn out to be especially efficient at this, since they don't just wade, they dive, which means their feathers make direct contact with the egg-rich sediment at the bottom. Their dense waterproof plumage also traps a layer of moisture that helps keep those eggs alive mid-flight. A single duck leaving one lake can carry dozens, sometimes hundreds, of viable eggs stuck to its body, ready to drop them the moment it lands somewhere new. There's a second, even stranger bird mechanism involving digestion. It sounds impossible at first, fish eggs surviving a trip through a bird's digestive system, but certain hard-shelled or resistant eggs genuinely do survive being eaten and excreted, fully intact and viable. This has been confirmed experimentally for specific species, and given how many eggs a fish-eating bird consumes in a single feeding session, even a small survival rate adds up to a meaningful number of eggs scattered in droppings. Birds also carry fish the obvious way, directly in their talons. An osprey or eagle that snags a fish, then gets mobbed by a rival bird and drops its catch, ends up depositing a live fish into whatever lake happens to be underneath at that exact moment. Mountain lakes sitting along the flight paths of hunting raptors periodically receive live fish dropped in from far lower elevations. Any single one of these drops has very low odds of leading to a surviving breeding population. But across decades, even centuries, of raptor activity passing overhead, those odds start adding up into something genuinely significant. Before we keep going, If this kind of hidden mechanism behind everyday nature fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Now, let's look at something people often overlook entirely: temporary water connections. Plenty of mountain lakes that look completely sealed off actually have brief, seasonal surface connections to other water bodies that most casual observers would never notice. Snowmelt surges and heavy rainstorms can create short-lived water channels linking normally separate lakes, sometimes lasting just hours, sometimes stretching on for weeks. During these fleeting windows, fish can actually swim between water bodies that are otherwise completely isolated the rest of the year. A fish population living in a lower lake, briefly connected to a higher lake by a spring meltwater channel, can use that narrow window to swim upstream and establish itself in the higher lake entirely on its own. Not every species can pull this off. The fish most likely to succeed are the ones biologically driven to fight their way upstream. Salmonids are the classic example. The anadromous members of that family evolved specifically to power through steep gradients and temporary channels that most other fish species wouldn't even attempt. Ancient mountain communities were intimately familiar with this pattern, even without understanding the mechanics behind it. The specific, predictable reappearance of fish in high mountain streams right after the spring melt was the kind of pattern any attentive observer of mountain waterways would notice season after season. It's likely this became embedded knowledge passed down through generations, a reliable seasonal event tied directly to food gathering. Someone who knew that a specific high pool filled with fish every year right after the snow melted could plan their seasonal movements around that fact, working from genuinely accurate ecological knowledge, even without any scientific framework to explain why it happened. Now let's get to the mechanism most directly tied to human history, and the one with the strongest documented evidence behind it. Ancient humans carried fish up to mountain lakes on purpose. This isn't speculation, it's documented across enough archaeological and historical evidence to be essentially beyond dispute. And their reasons for doing it were specific, varied, and, given what they knew and needed, entirely rational. The most extensively documented cases involve trout and other salmonids, introduced across multiple mountain ranges on multiple continents. The evidence differs by location. Sometimes it's written historical record, sometimes isotopic analysis revealing a break in the fish population's chemical signature consistent with an introduction event, and sometimes genetic analysis showing lowland genetic lineages showing up in supposedly isolated mountain fish. The motivation was simple from the perspective of the people doing it. A mountain lake stocked with fish meant a reliable protein source in an otherwise harsh, food-scarce environment. Stocking a lake was essentially an investment in future food security, useful for anyone traveling that route or settling nearby, even seasonally. Getting live fish up a mountain wasn't easy, but it was absolutely manageable with the tools available at the time. Fish were carried in water-filled containers, hide pouches, wooden vessels, or clay pots, always with the understanding that the fish needed to survive the journey, which meant careful attention to water temperature and oxygen levels along the way. Fish eggs packed in damp moss could survive conditions that would have killed an adult fish outright. Young fish, small enough to carry in bulk, were also far easier to transport than fully grown adults. People who regularly traveled these mountain routes built up detailed practical knowledge, which paths allowed for refilling water along the way, how long a trip could last before the fish started dying, which seasons offered water temperatures cool enough to keep the cargo alive. This was specialized, hard-won knowledge, built the same way all ancient ecological understanding was built, through direct observation and repeated trial and error. And this points to something the standard story of ancient people often gets wrong: the idea that they simply reacted to nature rather than actively managing it. In reality, some ancient communities were managing their food resources with a level of sophistication that modern conservation science only recently began to appreciate. Along river systems in the Pacific Northwest, ancient communities developed detailed knowledge of salmon population cycles. They practiced selective harvesting, careful about which sizes and sexes to take, and work to preserve key habitat features. All practices modern fisheries management would later independently discover to be optimal. These communities weren't running mathematical models of sustainable yield. They arrived at the same conclusions through generations of careful, sustained observation of what actually kept fish populations healthy versus what wiped them out. Communities that introduced fish into empty mountain lakes were applying that exact same logic to a new opportunity. A fishless mountain lake represented wasted potential, water, space, and an abundance of insects and invertebrates just waiting to be converted into a real, harvestable protein source. Choosing to stock that lake was a long-term investment. The fish introduced wouldn't be ready to harvest for seasons, sometimes years. And that kind of patience, planning years ahead rather than solving only for the immediate moment, is itself strong evidence of how sophisticated ancient ecological thinking really was. Quick pause here. If you're the kind of person who loves learning just how clever ancient humans actually were, this is exactly the kind of content we cover every week. So hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Now, here's a mechanism almost nobody talks about, but it's real, documented, and genuinely strange: tornadoes and waterspouts. Powerful rotating wind systems moving across open water can lift water and everything living in it straight up into the air. These systems can carry that water and any fish or eggs inside it for distances ranging from a few hundred meters to several kilometers before dropping it somewhere entirely different. This has actually been documented in modern times, through reports of fish literally raining down from the sky, landing in places nowhere near any body of water, after being swept up by a passing waterspout. Most fish transported this way don't survive. Between the exposure, the physical stress of being tossed through the air, and the impact of finally landing, the odds are stacked heavily against survival. But this mechanism doesn't need a high survival rate to matter. It only needs a small fraction of transported fish or eggs to land somewhere viable, and a mountain lake sitting downwind of a lower water source qualifies perfectly. Ancient people who witnessed fish falling from the sky, a phenomenon multiple cultures actually recorded and wove into their own belief systems, were watching the most dramatic possible version of this aerial transport process play out in real time. Old oral traditions describing fish suddenly appearing in high places after violent storms likely reflect genuine events people actually witnessed, even if the explanations their cultures gave for it look nothing like the biology we understand today. The real significance of this mechanism isn't that it happens often, because it clearly doesn't. Its significance is that it completes the picture. Every conceivable way fish could move uphill, geological shifts, glacial transport, birds, deliberate human effort, even violent storms, has been observed working in at least some real-world case. The fish actually swimming in any given mountain lake today represent the cumulative result of whichever combination of these mechanisms applied across that lake's entire existence. And once fish do arrive, whether by human hands or pure accident, the consequences for that lake's ecosystem are anything but neutral. A mountain lake with no fish develops its own distinct ecological community, built entirely around the absence of predation. Zooplankton, the tiny invertebrates that would normally be prime fish food, grow to dense populations and behave in ways shaped entirely by the lack of any visual predator hunting them. Insect larvae, mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, the same larvae trout love to eat, thrive freely in broad daylight, active at hours that would otherwise be extremely dangerous if fish were present. Introduce trout to a previously fishless lake, and you trigger what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a chain reaction of effects rippling outward through the entire food web. Trout eat zooplankton directly and compete with them for the same algae. Trout devour insect larvae by the thousands, and trout also eat amphibian larvae, the tadpoles and young salamanders, sharing those same shallow, productive lake margins that fish depend on too. The vulnerability of high-elevation frog and salamander populations to fish introduction has been documented extensively. Several alpine amphibian species that saw dramatic population crashes during the 20th century turned out to be specifically declining in lakes where fish had been introduced, while recovering nicely in lakes that either never got fish or had them later removed. The ancient introductions of fish to these mountain lakes were never neutral events. They permanently reshaped those lake ecosystems the moment they took hold. The people who introduced those fish were almost certainly aware, on some level, that things had changed. The fish they later caught and ate were living proof the introduction had worked. But the wider ripple effects on every other species in that lake would have been completely invisible to them, far outside anything their knowledge framework could have registered as a concern. So here's the complete picture of how fish end up in mountain lakes. Some arrived before the mountains even existed in their current form, carried upward by the same slow tectonic forces that built the peaks around them. Some rode inside glaciers during the ice ages, their eggs frozen solid and hauled from low-elevation waters up into high basins, where they were eventually deposited as the ice melted away. Some hitched a ride on the feet, feathers, and even the digestive tracts of water birds crossing elevation gradients on their normal migration routes. Some slipped through briefly during snowmelt floods, when temporary channels linked two lakes that stay completely separate the rest of the year. Some were hauled up deliberately by ancient humans who looked at an empty lake and saw an untapped food source worth the effort of stocking. And a rare few arrived the most dramatic way imaginable, falling from the open sky after a storm nobody happened to witness. Whichever mountain lake you're picturing right now owes its fish population to whichever combination of these forces applied to its specific geography, geology, elevation, and history. And it's entirely possible for several of these mechanisms to have shaped the very same lake at different points across thousands of years. A population that first arrived via glacial transport during the Pleistocene might later have been topped up by birds during the Holocene, then supplemented again by deliberate human stocking once people started living nearby. Ancient people fishing these lakes, people who depended on that catch just to survive, were staring at exactly the same question we opened with, minus every single one of the explanations laid out here. They knew the fish were there. They knew exactly how to catch them. Whatever explanation their culture offered for how those fish first got into a lake with no visible connection to anything below probably fit within whatever cosmological framework made sense of the world around them. Some of those old explanations were likely closer to the truth than others. None of them, understandably, predicted frozen fish eggs riding inside glaciers, or eggs sticking to a duck's feet, or the cascading ecological chaos that follows a single introduced trout. But the practical knowledge itself that mountain lakes could hold fish, that reaching them was worth the effort, that stocking a new lake was a smart long-term investment, was completely accurate, deeply useful, and reflects just how sophisticated ancient ecological understanding really was when applied to the harsh realities of mountain living. The fish are there, in that lake right now, and the ancient traveler climbing toward it, carrying a container of water with 2 live trout sloshing inside, wasn't wondering how fish got into other mountain lakes somewhere else. They were making absolutely sure this lake would have fish waiting for whoever came through next. And honestly, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to care about.